It's go time.
Only 2 wins separate first from fifth in the Western Conference after Labor Day. Rough Riders' Miles Brown hit on Blue Bombers' Zach Collaros draws the ire of Winnipeg president Wade Miller. Calgary quarterback Jake Maier throws 4 interceptions versus Edmonton. Is his job in trouble? Welcome to Third Down Gamble with your hosts, Don Charbin and Heath Graham.
Great to have Derek Taylor on our last show. Fantastic guest. You can look forward to listening to him again at season's end. He is a real resource and a treasure. Heath, we've got the Labor Day weekend out of the way. OK Tire, major sponsor of the weekend. Fantastic turnout. 3 of the games were sold out. Calgary had their biggest crowd of the season. Let's go right back to where it all started, Touchdown Pacific in Victoria. What a great event that was. But the most discussion, other than the fact that the Lions end their losing streak in significantly profound fashion by throttling the Red Blacks, was Nathan Rourke and Farhan Lalji at halftime. You saw it. What's your read on that?
I don't really care so much about the going into the half and coming out of the half interviews. I understand absolutely where Nathan Rourke was coming from. He's been under the spotlight for these 3 weeks that he's been back. Finally, things were going right. The BC Lions got off to a fantastic start in that game, and he just wanted to get into the locker room and get ready for the second half. I don't think he owes anybody anything more than that. I find those interviews, you generally get more out of the coaches, but it's all pretty cookie cutter. Nothing really profound comes out of those interviews, and he kept it brief and went about his business. I'm perfectly okay with that.
And I'm with him as well. He's been under such a microscope and so much pressure, most of it external in the case of the Lions hoping to break out of this losing streak and wanting them to find that command of the field that he had back 2 years ago. For Rourke, I know he wanted to do that, but the pressure was on him. But he's not really an extroverted type of out there in your face type of guy. He's more quiet. I want to do my job. And it's really tough when a guy has had that much pressure on him. He knows that Farhan is probably going to ask him something about his personal stats. He doesn't care. That's not the issue to him. He wants to win the game. Right at that point, they're up by 25. He's ecstatic that they're doing that, but he wants to go into that locker room and figure out with the rest of the team what they're going to do in that second half so they don't squander it.
What is the purpose of those interviews? What do the broadcasters hope to gain from it? Because you generally get enough time to ask them 2 or 3 questions, and as I said, they're not going to generally throw somebody under the bus, except maybe Scott Milanovic. He's been pretty pointed in some of his interviews coming in or out of a half. But beyond that, they're all going to say the same thing. We need to keep doing what we're doing, or we need to make adjustments and shut the other team down.
It's a wall being broken down, technically, because you're getting an insight by talking to somebody who's actually participating in the football game. The problem with the setup, and this has nothing to do with TSN, there's a real problem the way it happens, is that on one side of the field, you get the team as they go to the locker room, and then on the other side of the field, you get them as they come out of the locker room. The better interview is the one I find that has been in the locker room, talked about what they wanted to accomplish, and then came out and got interviewed. The guy going in, the adrenaline, everything like that is so fresh. I don't know that they're really prepared to have a great discussion about anything. And for Nathan Rourke, he did say, I don't like normally doing halftime because the job's not done. It's never done. I don't mind talking to you guys after, even if it takes time away from my family. He was very gracious about that. I don't think he has to defend what he said. Even at the time, I thought there was just too much made of it.
I agree. I think it was just a lighthearted moment, and sometimes people read into it more than what it is. I believe that's what happened in this case. I don't think it's anything offensive on behalf of Nathan Rourke. I don't think Farhan Lalji is terribly upset by the way it went. I think you just need to laugh it off and move on.
Exactly. And Farhan's a very strong media personality. He's been through a lot of stuff before. Nothing's really going to faze him. I know there was a lot of joking going around saying he was looking for Rourke to do the interview again, but he caught him at the end of the game, and Rourke was very obliging. And for the audience that watched, it was a little bit more of a storyline. Great. The Red Blacks without two receivers and just not really any help on the defense, losing their middle linebacker. The Red Blacks were struggling in that football game, down 31-6 at halftime. They tried to make a game of it, and it just fell way short. The Lions were overdue. That was what Rourke was about. He wanted to win a football game. It had been a while since he won a football game. You think back to the last time he played and won in the CFL, you're going a long time back to that season, because remember, he had that injury with his foot that occurred in Regina, the Lefranc injury that kicked him out of the rest of the season. Next time he steps on the field, it's in the West Final, and he loses. So it's about time for him. He wanted to win. He got what he wanted.
He did, and I think this was the performance that people were expecting to see from Nathan Rourke. I know I took him in my fantasy pool this week because I felt he's got those 2 games under his belt. He's going to start hitting his stride, and that's exactly what we saw. I understand completely why he didn't want to lose that momentum and take time out of his focus to conduct a sideline interview.
And credit to Farhan, he didn't make any big deal about it either. He was kind of, I know what his feelings are. I know the type of person he is. I kind of half expected this could be an outcome. It happened. Farhan moved on. He went and did the next interview with Bob Dice that he had to do as the Red Blacks came out of the locker room. Life went on. He still talked to Rourke at the end of the game. This, to me, I love it from Rourke. Winning is what matters. Personal stats, I don't care. So long as the W's are on the board at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how we get there.
Another hard hit on a quarterback has prompted Winnipeg Blue Bombers president Wade Miller to call for sanctions by the league, looking specifically at Miles Brown's hit on Zach Collaros in the first half of Sunday's game between the Bombers and the Riders. I don't know exactly what Miller's hoping to accomplish, especially since he was silent when Rhett Cramdy hit Drew Brown earlier in the season.
I understand when your franchise quarterback is hurt by a play that was a foul. It was called on the field correctly. For Collaros, it was chest pain more than anything that was bothering him. But again, it's a late hit, and you could tell it was kind of a shot that Brown wasn't afraid to give.
That's true, and I would not be surprised if we see more clarification, more black and white on how these are going to be punished in the off-season. I understand where Wade Miller's coming from because it is his franchise quarterback, but we need to look at the precedent. And we had this discussion earlier on the Rhett Cramdy hit on Drew Brown about precedent and what needs to be done. It's pretty tough to suspend Miles Brown based on what he did on this play when you haven't had suspensions earlier on in the season. If they want to make it a point, they need to say, moving forward, a hit like this will result in. I don't think they can hold him up right now as a suspended player because of this play, but they can certainly use the replay, break it all down, and show what occurred and say, after this will result in an ejection, a game check fine, or a 1-game suspension, whatever the case is.
You can point back to the Cramdy hit on Brown. You can also point back to Miles Brown on Drew Brown in the game that Saskatchewan played in Ottawa. In that case, though, he had been tripped up, but he fell on Drew Brown's leg, and it caused him to miss some time. The other one that I was thinking about was Niles Morgan from the Elks taking a shot at Taylor Powell. Same sort of situation where, And if you read the letter of the law, it's an intent to injure. It's essentially a fist, a forearm, an elbow, the top of your head, shoulder, whatever the case may be. If you're using them as objects to pound as an object to injure, then yeah, you need to be sanctioned against this. It hasn't been the CFL's way to typically follow up and say, that not only cost you that roughing penalty, but now it's going to be upgradable to a game that we're going to suspend you for. But they can do it. It's not outside the realm. It's just not something they typically do.
You're right. And I think maybe for the rest of this season, you need to look at ejection from the game in which those plays occur. Supplemental discipline like suspensions and fines, I think is something that you need to address in the offseason and come up with more quantitative notes on what warrants what. I think it's, and I know every penalty is a judgment call. However, this one, if we are serious about protecting quarterbacks, I agree 100% more needs to be done. Let's start moving in that direction.
Exactly. And to put it on the commissioner's shoulders, I'm not so sure. I mean, yes, he is kind of the champion of the league, and maybe he needs to say something about it. But I think you could do it behind closed doors a lot better and just inform the officials that if you see this again, it's a grade 2 and it's 25 and the person's gone. And make it simple. If Miles Brown had been tossed from the game, I think Wade Miller wouldn't be talking right now because he got to play the rest of the game and Zach Collaros did not. Then you wonder, how is that an equitable distribution of application of the foul? Especially if they head official or if they get some help from the booth and get some direction to saying that he did not hold back when he had the opportunity, this was intent, then boom, 25 and you're gone. Going deeper into that Rough Rider game, the Saskatchewan Rough Riders, if you can sort of look at it this way, that the Heavens were doing everything possible to give them an opportunity to win at the end of the game. They got it. The Rough Riders, of course, score a touchdown very late in that football game, but they fail on a 2-point convert when Trevor Harris decides to throw it through a linebacker. The Riders then try a short kick, beautifully executed by Brett Lothar. It goes towards Willie Jefferson. He stands there, hoping that the ball will just come to him, and Roland Milligan gets in the way, bats it around. The Rough Riders recover at their 46, and suddenly with 12 seconds to go in the game, the Saskatchewan Rough Riders have the ball, needing a field goal to win against Winnipeg. They then have a pass interference call on the following play where it is intercepted by Winnipeg, but the official, the field judge, way at the back of the play, calls a pass interference call. Now, being at the stadium, you and I saw this, where they started to mark the ball at the 42-yard line and then moved it back to the 52, and that was where the foul occurred, not anywhere else. And Rough Riders still have a chance on that final play to kick a field goal and win. There's 3 seconds left. They can do something. Brett Lothar hits it as hard as he can, but it falls short. Just the tirade against Brett Lothar, and without really justifiable reasons as to why he missed that field goal, because people don't really understand what the weather was at that time if you're picking on Brett Lothar for coming up short.
We saw 3 successful field goals of more than 50 yards. Lothar had one from 55. I believe Sergio Castillo had one from 52 and one from 57. They were all going the other direction in the stadium. And even from where we were sitting, you couldn't feel a really strong breeze. But after the game, once you got outside, you could feel it a bit more. And the way Mosaic Stadium is configured, that south end is wide open, but for the scoreboard and jumbo screen. So there isn't a lot to block wind. He was kicking a 59-yarder into a pretty stiff wind and came up well short. I don't think you can fault Brett Lothar for that. The camera angle was from behind him when he made the kick, so you could see it was on line, but I don't know if there's a kicker in the CFL that would have had the leg to make that into the wind that he was facing.
All of the long field goals, as you indicated, went toward the other end, and that was wind assisted. 28 kilometers an hour out of the southeast. That means that Lothar had to overcome that and the distance. And people have chided him or the team or whatever over this, claiming that he's supposed to have this super strong leg and how could he have come that short when Castillo was making these field goals. Well, you're right. You and I, we couldn't feel the wind, and it's just the way the stadium is configured and how the roof works and how it channels air around. But down on the field, and especially when we walked down to that level, you could feel the wind down there. So that's what the players had to work around. And if you look at the kicks, the punts going north went way further than any punts going south, kickoffs going north. Even Castillo kicked a single with a kickoff going north. Wasn't hitting it past the 20 going south.
And to recap, the Riders won the toss and deferred to the second half. Did Corey Mace make a rookie head coach mistake to not take the wind? They took the ball coming out to start the second half as opposed to the wind in the fourth quarter. We can look at that as something that possibly hindered their opportunity to win.
There's this belief among coaches that if you're too far behind at halftime, and the Rough Riders were down 29-14, that you can't compound your situation in the third quarter. You got to start making a comeback right away. So they typically take the wind initially, and the Blue Bombers were more than happy to have it in the fourth quarter. Now, at that time, the Rough Riders probably didn't know that Zach Collaros wouldn't be coming back out to play. Chris Streveler isn't Zach Collaros back there, and the Winnipeg offense changes dramatically. I think under this circumstance with the Rough Riders, I would still want that wind in the fourth quarter. You don't know that it's going to come to a final field goal. By the 3-minute rule and all of the timing that goes on in the fourth quarter, you get so many more plays. As a matter of just this is the way it's got to be, I always want the wind in the fourth quarter.
Moving to the quarterback situation in Winnipeg, as we mentioned, Zach Collaros was unable to take the field in the second half. Chris Streveler came in relief, and the Bombers struggled mightily to move the ball. Are the Bombers in trouble if Chris Streveler is the quarterback moving forward?
I think so. And it was raised in a lot of places what was going on with the offensive play calling. Streveler in that game, a full 30 minutes that he had to play, threw one ball that was in excess of 5 yards down the field. Ultra-conservative approach to what you want to do. And I'm not clear as to why they were so scared unless they don't trust his arm. And if they don't trust his arm, why is he your backup quarterback?
Given that they had a 15-point lead at the half, I think they went into a bit of a conservative mode as well. But we saw Streveler even struggle to connect on screen passes and short outs to Brady Oliveira. He threw a couple of them that were nowhere near the receiver. And I get you've got a quarterback coming back that hasn't played a lot of in-game action over the last 3 years as he bounced around NFL practice rosters. But if he's your quarterback, you need to count on him to throw, and you need to open up the playbook enough to allow him to do so, especially when you look at an offensive line without Patty Neufeld, without Stanley Bryant. There's some holes there, so the running game was going to struggle. You're already playing against one of the best run-stop defenses in the league. Once the Riders realized that it was Streveler back there, they really focused on taking away the run and did a fantastic job of eliminating long runs by the Bombers. And they made them have to try to play a passing game that was not working out.
In his career, Streveler has thrown 20 touchdown passes, 20 interceptions. In that game against Saskatchewan, which he didn't do very much, he was 4 of 6 for 46 yards and a half of football. And it wasn't like Winnipeg was running roughshod with Oliveira either. Had it not been for Lucky Whitehead getting a huge punt return, the Blue Bombers were in tough that second half and would have likely been beaten by the Rough Riders if a couple of those events hadn't happened. In fact, if you can point to the play by Mario Alford where he muffs the punt and Nick Hallett jumps on it in the end zone for a touchdown, the Bombers were outplayed in that football game. But if you're giving him an extra opportunity by having your quarterback not throw because you're afraid of him, oy. And it begs the question, what do you do coming up this Saturday in the Banjo Bowl? If Collaros is ruled out, what do you do?
I think this week they have to have Collaros taking a lot. Sorry. I think this week coming up, they have to have Streveler taking a lot of first team reps and get more comfortable in passing situations and hope for the best. I mean, they do have a third string quarterback that hasn't seen the field outside of preseason. So we don't know what they have there. But if you've got a quarterback that can't throw for more than 60 yards in a game, you might have to take that chance. I think the Bombers are hoping that Collaros is going to be game ready for the rematch. It doesn't appear early on this week that it is a long-term injury by any means, but we don't know the full impact of what happened to Zach Collaros and what kind of shape he's going to be in for Saturday.
Goes back to my original question, though. What are you going to do? If you don't trust the guy that you brought in to do the work against Saskatchewan, and he didn't do much against Calgary when they played the Stampeders, and he certainly did very little against the Red Blacks. In fact, they ran Oliveira almost incessantly against the Red Blacks to win that football game. It's not like his numbers are out of this world anywhere in these games that he's been playing. If you don't trust him, you got to look at Terry Wilson. That's the third string that they brought from camp. He's there. He can throw. He's a scrambler as well. He gives you the same sort of look that Streveler does. Or do you roll Streveler and hope for the best? You shouldn't have to do that. This is kind of like you're looking at Wilson, who's the rookie, and you'd be saying, okay, we've got no choice. But Streveler's a veteran. This is his 5th year in the league. He should know how to work this game.
Hi, I'm Darren Flutie, and you're listening to the Third Down Gamble podcast.
With the recent return of Nathan Rourke and Matthew Betts to the BC Lions, a lot has been discussed about the salary cap and where the BC Lions are going to fit into it this season. It appears to most observers that the Lions are going to be over the cap in some way. I guess the question that comes up right now is, how much over are they going to be, and how much over is the ownership, is owner Amar Daman willing to be and facing the penalties for being over?
If the Lions go over the cap, it's not the first time. 4 teams went over last year. Granted, they were all small amounts, but they have been there before. It's about the fine structure that's associated. And Amar Daman, who was asked by the panel if you're going over, then he was kind of cagey and coy about it, saying, look, we're here to play football and win football games, and that's what matters. The fine structure is pretty set out. It's up to $100,000. It's a dollar for dollar fine. You go up to $200,000, and then it gets doubled. If you go to $300,000, it gets trebled. You start losing draft picks beyond $100,000. The Montreal Alouettes in 2007 most famously went way over the cap, and the next season they had nothing at the draft board.
One saving grace possibly for the BC Lions is they would be looking at a potential trade to Vernon Adams Jr. and could grab some draft picks in return for that. So if they could get a first or second rounder in return for trading VA, it doesn't leave them that much further back of where they would have been had they been cap compliant. I know there are some people that get very upset when teams go over the salary cap. It's a soft cap. They have it laid out what the penalties are. And if the Lions are willing to face those penalties in an attempt to win a Grey Cup at home this season, it's their right to do so. The other issue that may need to be addressed is with the marketing money that's available to teams as well. There isn't a cap on that at this point. Betts did not receive any marketing money in his contract for the remainder of 2024. It may be something that needs to be looked at before it gets out of hand. It does allow you to get some marquee players in, but how much do you want to let that go?
Like anything that has a cap associated with it, the NFL, Major League Baseball, hockey, they're all fighting this question all the time. Owners want to pay to get the best players to play for their team. Other owners don't want to lose money hand over fist trying to keep up. And so you have this tension between the rich and the poor over how do we make this happen. Now the CFL, yes, that marketing money, but it's not as significant as what most people think. You're talking about tens of thousands of dollars, not hundreds of thousands. That will sort of mitigate any impact on the cap if you are stuck up against it. You can offer this sort of stuff, but they still have to perform. And this is the other thing too, is that it's not money you just throw at the guy. No, they have to actually do something for it. This is above and beyond their normal working hours that they're going to be paid to do promotion for the league. I think it's okay. The other part of it is people are so upset. It's why does BC get to do it in the first place? Well, like you said, it's a soft cap. It's there to be a disincentive, but there are times when you may wish to go over. For instance, the Lions host the Grey Cup this year. How incentivized is Amar Daman to have the Lions in that football game? Massively so. So he's going to do everything he can to make sure that his team is there.
And there's no guarantee they will be. They could be 250,000 over the cap, and any of the teams in the West could knock them off in a West Division final, and they don't even get to play the Grey Cup. It's a risk that the Lions are willing to take at this point, but there are no guarantees in football, as we saw with the results of some of these Labor Day games.
Go back to that 2007 Montreal Alouette team that went way over the cap. They did not make the Grey Cup that year. They were wiped out long before. It's not a guarantee. You can spend, you may not receive. The Canadian Football League had that arbitration meeting with Sean Lemon to decide his future with the league in terms of his gambling that he had been accused of doing while he was a member of the Calgary Stampeders. He never bet against the Stampeders, but he did bet small amounts on games in which he was involved. Now, the league was very sincere and strict about this notion that you cannot, A, bet on your own team, but B, bet on the league anyway. Sean Lemon did it. Granted, it was small amounts, but the league won the arbitration, and he's suspended indefinitely. Is that a strong enough message for others that are tempted?
I believe it is, and I've made my feelings on gambling and the way it affects the league. I've made my feelings felt in the past. I think it's something that if you're counting on gambling revenue, this is a tough look for the league given the small amounts that Sean Lemon is accused of wagering. However, for the integrity of the league, I understand where they're coming from on this. A tough situation. It is an indefinite suspension right now. It's not a lifetime ban. We don't know what that means yet, or if there will be a path moving forward that will allow Sean Lemon to return.
There probably is a path, and part of it is going to be contrition on his part and probably community work and stuff like that. It's going to be a long road for him to get back. The commissioner was very adamant that this was not going to be part of the Canadian Football League. Now, the NFL's had their troubles with it. The league was clear, and we have enough evidence.
Calgary Stampeders quarterback Jake Mayer struggled mightily in the Labor Day loss to the Edmonton Elks. Coach Dave Dickinson has been a bit non-committal about the starting quarterback for the Stampeders moving forward. Is this the start of the end for Jake Mayer, or is there an ability for him to take control and reestablish himself as the number one guy?
He's the one guy that's been playing as starting quarterback consecutively for any franchise in this league for the last 3 years. He's also not winning football games as their quarterback. And there are times when the Stampeders' offense goes off and their defense doesn't keep up. But more often than not, the defense gives them enough with which to win, and the offense comes up short. And when you look at a 4-interception game against the Edmonton Elks, where 2 of the interceptions happened almost in the exact same spot in the field, the 5 to 15 yard line in that range, where you're giving up not only the possession but points, that really hurts. Your coach comes out and says, well, he played a bad game. I don't know where we're going from here. For Dave Dickinson, he's got to start really wondering, what am I going to do next? But then the question is, where do you go? Is it Logan Bonner? Is it Tommy Stevens? How do you approach this? Or, dare I say, do they start talking trade with the BC Lions?
I don't know if we'll see Vernon Adams get moved this season yet, just based on he's a nice security blanket to have for the Lions. I don't think they're in a position where they have to move him yet. And they've made that quite clear that they're not looking to move him this season. The Stampeders need to start investigating that. As we've mentioned the one positive you can say about Jake Maier is he's durable. He's made every start last season and so far this season. But the Stamps only won 6 games last year with Jake Maier as their starting quarterback. They're 4-6 this year with Jake Maier as their starting quarterback. He's had some flashes of brilliance, but there's been a lot of games where he's struggled and has left points out there that would have turned losses into wins. I've been a bit critical of him in the past, saying he needs to prove himself as the starter, and this inconsistency right now has me continuing to question whether he's the guy. I would love to see Logan Bonner get a chance. We don't really know yet what he has to offer. It's a pretty small sample size. Tommy Stevens, we know they have him more as their short yardage specialist, but again, let's maybe see what he can do. At this point, as they slide down the standings, I know they're still in playoff range because the West is under a blanket, but you need to do something to start to assert yourself in the West.
Tommy Stevens reminds me of Chris Streveler. He's a bit of an unknown when it comes to passing. Tommy Stevens has much less on his resume for someone to review than does Chris Streveler. It would be a bold move if the Stampeders go that route. I've been hard on Pat Delmonico, their offensive coordinator, thinking that they were just far too conservative in the way they approached the game. But against Edmonton, they let it fly. They threw a lot of deep routes. The Stampeders receivers collided with each other to eliminate one of the receptions. They had Reggie Bagleton make some great catches down the field, but penalties took them away. They just seemed like the Stampeders, if Maier was on target, it was something else that was going to take it away from him. But in that fourth quarter, when you needed him to be at his best, he wasn't.
I agree. He has struggled in certain situations. And as I said, a 6-win season last year. You're 2 games below 500 right now and going the wrong way in the division. It may be time for a change. I don't know how confident Dave Dickenson is in the backup quarterbacks. As we said, they are pretty untested in the CFL. They need something to change, and right now, a 4-interception game at home in a Labor Day Classic is a tough pill to swallow.
And this is a franchise that's used to winning. They're used to being in the playoffs. Right now, they're tied with the Elks in the standings. They've got another game with Edmonton coming up, and then they play Saskatchewan. They've got the teams they need to beat staring them in the face. They've got to just do something with it. Maier, it's not all his fault that the Stampeders lost. They gave up over 550 yards of offense. McCall Bethel-Thompson threw for 468 in that game, 3 touchdowns. So the defense wasn't doing them anything either. And one of the things that if you remember in one of the podcasts that we had earlier when we were talking about when Streveler did have a good series and went down the field against the Stampeders to set up that overtime game in Calgary, the Stampeders' zone defense, they have to teach their halfbacks and cornerbacks how to defend in a zone defense. You don't just run back there, stand in a spot, and watch what happens. So often, and we saw it with DeMario Houston, who is a reputable defender, look back into the backfield to see what the quarterback is doing. Well, you're not going to follow the receiver if you're staring at the quarterback. You've got to move to where the receiver is when that receiver enters your zone.
If Edmonton completes the sweep of the back-to-back, Calgary would be alone in last place in the West. Is that enough for them to really consider making some changes?
Knowing that the Stampeders have this tradition of winning, knowing that even though John Hufnagel is not the president, he's going to be pushing for some change too. And here's a question to you. You're Dave Dickenson. We've seen Chris Jones struggle as both GM and head coach. Is it something that maybe Dave Dickenson has to look at? And dare I ask the question, because I don't know of anybody that would do this, but does he give up the GM job? Because he's proven to be a very good coach.
It would be very tough for him to take that, I guess, demotion at this point. I strongly believe that it is a very difficult task for anybody to be a head coach and GM in this league. It's almost impossible to hold both positions and be successful. You have to have a great team around you as well, but at the end of the day, it is still the head coach's decision on the field, and it is still the general manager's decision off the field. And if both of those are falling on your plate, it's a very difficult thing to do. I believe Dave Dickinson wants to be the general manager, but as you said, he's much more successful and I think much more suited to be a head coach.
British Columbia is the lone example where you have Rick Campbell and Neil McAvoy sharing the GM duties, but Campbell is still the head coach. I'm not saying that Dickinson is a poor GM. He's had a very short tenure in that position, so it's harder to say, but something's got to give. You can't always blame the players. Does Brent Monson need to rethink about how he runs his defense? Does DeMonico have to reset the offense even again? Maybe it's not his fault, but he, as was suggested that by Derek Taylor, that maybe he's got a quarterback that's got a limited set, and you've got to work within that even tighter.
Continuing the discussion of head coaches, with the win over the Rough Riders on Sunday, Blue Bombers head coach Mike O'Shea notched his 102nd win as a head coach, tying him with Blue Bomber great Bud Grant. When this was mentioned to O'Shea in the post-game interview, he said, "I do not deserve to ever be mentioned in the same sentence as Bud Grant." I think there's a lot of people that maybe disagree, and O'Shea is being too humble.
Bud Grant is a legend in Winnipeg. He's also a legend in Minnesota as well in the NFL. He was an offensive lineman that became head coach in the late 1950s and took the Bombers to a myriad of Grey Cups. They only played a 16-game schedule, so it was tougher for him to get the total wins, but the Bombers were so dominant every season that those wins came rapidly. Think of this. The Blue Bombers as a franchise, I think, are hovering around or just past 700 wins overall in their existence. O'Shea or Grant was responsible for 1 in 7 of those wins. If you combine them, you're looking at 1 in every 3.5 to 4 games that those two men alone coached a Winnipeg team to victory.
You look at the long history of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, and you have those two, and you throw in a Cal Murphy, and that's pretty much edging up towards half of their win total. Those are two legendary coaches. I know Mike O'Shea is being quite humble in this, but you have to look at where the Bombers were in the years prior to Mike O'Shea taking over as head coach. He has done some amazing things. I know he doesn't want to think about it right now, but he's 1 win away from being the winningest head coach in Blue Bombers history, something that's likely to occur sometime in the remainder of this season. He's, I believe, a little bit underappreciated right now for everything he has done, but this is something monumental and a real feather in the cap for Coach O'Shea.
Bud Grant and Mike O'Shea share a lot of things in common outside of the fact that they're winners and they've won Grey Cups. They are strong personalities, they are humble personalities, and they are very good people. The players that played for Bud Grant revered him. The players that have played for Mike O'Shea revere him. You can't ask much more, and let's face it, the Bombers have been very blessed to have two such men in their history guiding their teams.
Third down.
Now that the OK Tire Labor Day weekend is in the rearview mirror, we move forward now to a couple of rematches. First, let's get to Friday night and a somewhat traditional game where BC goes to Montreal around this time of the year. The Lions coming off a huge win, breaking their losing streak. Then on the flip side, you get the Alouettes, who didn't play on Labor Day weekend, having that best record in the Canadian Football League. With the Alouettes 3.5-point favorites, how do you see this one playing out?
A couple of big advantages for Montreal. One is coming off the bye. Two is you've got the BC Lions traveling all the way from Vancouver Island to Montreal this week. A big travel schedule for them to get there. The Lions showed a lot with Nathan Rourke in their win over Ottawa last week, but you're playing the Montreal Alouettes at home, who have been a force this year. I'm going to take the Alouettes, but I'm going to take the Lions to beat the spread. I think they're going to keep it close, but the Alouettes will pull this one out in the end.
If there's anything that's going to be an Achilles heel of the Alouettes so far at home this year, it is the fact that the first halves of games there have been really rough. They were well behind against the Saskatchewan Roughriders. They were well behind against the Edmonton Elks. They got behind against Toronto, never managed to come back. You can't keep that trend going of faltering in the first half, figuring it out at halftime, and then hoping to make it all the way back. If the Alouettes do that against the Lions, I don't think it's going to happen. I'm with you. I'm going to take the Lions against the spread. But curious little note, Nathan Rourke, when he takes his second snap in Percival Molson, that's going to be the most snaps he's taken there in his career. Injury kept him away once, and he was the backup to Michael Riley one time where he took one snap to rush the ball.
Saturday marks the first triple header of the season. Game 1 is the Toronto Argonauts in Ottawa taking on the Red Blacks at TD Place Stadium. The home team is a 1.5 point favorite. Both teams coming off of a loss. What are your thoughts on this one?
Argonauts look decent against the Tiger Cats. They're certainly looking better with the quarterbacking of Chad Kelly. The problem with the Argonauts with the game in Hamilton was that their defensive secondary got torched by Bo Levi Mitchell. Gave up a couple of long touchdowns. If they don't correct that, then the Red Blacks at home, especially that they're coming off a stinging loss in Victoria, I think they'll be highly motivated. This one's going to be really close, and as the 1.5 spread in favor of the home team indicates, that means that they're slightly nudging the betting line towards Toronto, and we've talked about that. The home team always gets a +3. They're kind of thinking Ottawa may not have enough. Now, it comes down, is Jalen Ackland back in the lineup? Do they have Braylon Addison back in the lineup? Those are a couple of key cogs that they missed out on the West Coast. Chad Kelly is the wild card. How well does he play? If he's getting better, watch out. This one is a true pick'em. I'll probably go with the Argonauts ultimately.
One other note for the Red Blacks, they released running back Raquel Armstead this week as well. So a bit of a shake-up for the Red Blacks. I do like the Red Blacks at home in this one. Drew Brown has had a couple of big games where he's thrown for over 350 yards. As you mentioned, Argonauts secondary did get torched by Bo Levi Mitchell. I think Drew Brown and the Red Blacks bounce back in this one, put up some big numbers. I'm taking them to win and to cover.
And the Red Blacks, too, to be fair, are on a couple of extra days rest compared to the Argonauts, who just played literally last Monday. But the travel for the Red Blacks going through a lot of time zones to get back home is going to mitigate all of that as well. This should be the best game to watch. It should have all the fireworks you want in a Canadian game. We go to the second game of the triple header, which is the Banjo Bowl, the Saskatchewan Roughriders and the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. For those of you not initiated, why is it called the Banjo Bowl? Well, that was Troy Westwood, the kicker for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, and he made this comment as the Roughriders were coming in to play a West semifinal in 2003, calling Saskatchewan folk blah, 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 banjo pickers. David Asper, who was heavily involved with the Blue Bombers at the time, kind of liked the idea, pushed it forward, and thus the Banjo Bowl came about. It's been a game dominated by the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Of the 19 played, they've won 12. They have also won the last few by increasingly huge margins. How do you see this?
As of this recording, we haven't seen the Bombers on the practice field this week, so we don't know about the health of Zach Collaros. That is the big question mark so far. In the post-game comments, Mike O'Shea seemed to indicate that it was precautionary that he did not play in the second half of the Labor Day Classic. If he plays, I think the Bombers continue the tradition. They moved the ball well against Saskatchewan in the first half at Mosaic Stadium. If he plays, I believe the Bombers win. I don't know if it's going to be a blowout like we've seen the last couple of years, but certainly enough to cover a 2.5 point spread.
Well, let's go back to 2019, where this era of blowouts began. It started with Cody Fajardo versus Chris Streveler, and Streveler led the Blue Bombers to a 35-10 win. Then we go to 2021, because of no game in 2020. The Bombers win 33-9. Zach Collaros is their quarterback. In 2022, again with Collaros leading the way against Fajardo, it is a 54-20 win. And then last year, which was the nail in the coffin, I think, for Craig Dickinson was that humiliation of 51-6, where the Blue Bombers, I think, scored on their first 6 drives, touchdown. This game has been a humiliation central for the Rough Riders for the last 5 years. If they don't turn it around with something that says that they belong in this game, then I think the wheels are going to start really coming off this team, despite the fact that Trevor Harris claims that they're a championship team. Well, you haven't put that on the field. You've got a losing record, and you're on a massive losing streak. And the third thing is, when you divide the season into 6s, you're 0-5 and a tie in the last 6. What spells championship in all of that? Curiously, just for trivia folk, the last time the Rough Riders won in 2018, it was Zach Collaros who led them.
So Zach has had some success in this Banjo Bowl for sure.
I'm going to go with Winnipeg in the cover at 2.5. That's, to me, is a cheap one.
Rounding out the weekend, we have the return match. The Calgary Stampeders head north to Edmonton to take on the Elks. The home team is a 2.5 favorite in this one. Can the Elks complete the back-to-back sweep against Calgary and leapfrog them in the standings?
I think they can, and I have little doubt that they will. As much as I haven't been a fan of McLeod Bethel-Thompson this year, he showed me up with that game that he played in Calgary. 468 yards passing, 3 touchdown passes. I've always argued that he's a bit mercurial. He's the type of guy that if he can stay steady, in other words, keep providing that type of offensive structure that gives Edmonton a lot of chances early in the game as they did against Calgary, I don't see how, with Jake Mayer, the Stampeders are going to answer this. The Stampeders' defense got torched. What do you change? Do you come with more man coverage? Is that the way to beat the Elks? Or do you blitz incessantly? And I don't know where the Stampeders find a way to win this game. Overall, I know that the Stampeders are leading this series 19-15, but the Elks won last year. The Stampeders had dominated with Bo Levi Mitchell there. Edmonton is on the rise. Calgary is sort of struggling in the mud right now.
I tend to agree with you on this one. The other thing of note is Trey Ford did dress in the Labor Day game, so he is ready to go as well. So if there is any inkling of a struggle by McLeod Bethel-Thompson, we know the kind of energy Trey Ford can inject into this offense. I like the Elks at home. I think they're going to complete this sweep. And to think that 2 teams that started 0-7 and 0-4 this season are now on the rise and climbing through this West Division, it's amazing to see. I like the Elks' chances here, and if they win this one and the Bombers win the Banjo Bowl, we have to start talking playoffs for the Edmonton Elks.
And the Rough Riders will be at the bottom with the Stampeders looking up if all things play out the way they can. The only thing that's saving them right now is that tie. They'll be still a half a game or 1 point ahead of Edmonton. Just before we leave this, I want to ask you something, and this has been something I've been thinking about for a long time. Would not these 2 games, and maybe even a Toronto-Hamilton rematch that wasn't played this year, be better served on Thanksgiving weekend?
It would add some spark to Thanksgiving weekend for sure. I understand the argument for it, but there is such a powerful following in the prairies to have these games back to back. It just creates the animosity. I like the way it is right now. I understand for travel purposes, it's a lot easier to travel on a long weekend, as we saw the large number of blue jerseys in the stands at Mosaic Stadium last weekend. A little bit tougher. Now they have moved this game to Saturday, which helps Rider fans travel to Winnipeg. I like it where it is. We maybe need to look at establishing some more tradition on Thanksgiving weekend as well. I'm certainly not opposed to that. I just don't know exactly what that would look like.
The reason why I argue in favor of maybe changing this up, you still have the animosity because it's about a 5-week gap. It's not going to change much. The other thing, too, is let's look at it in 2 different views. One is, what if one team is down and the other is up? Well, if it's the home team that's down and the road team that's up, then they've got more time to get people assembled to pack that stadium. And that's Thanksgiving weekend. You get that extra holiday day. That's huge. And the other part of the equation, as I say, is, and you're saying, is let's make more of a tradition of Thanksgiving. I would like to see certain games always be played on Thanksgiving, that we know that this is going to be happening. And an Argonauts Ticats game would be fantastic. Elks Stampeders, great. Why not toss in the Banjo Bowl and move it and call it the Banjo Turkey Bowl or something like that, and just put it on that Saturday of that weekend? I just really do believe that people want more on a long weekend, and especially at that time of the year when families are coming together.
I think my argument for keeping it on the week after Labor Day is it just is such a shakeup in the standings between these two weekends. And we see if they split, nothing really changes. If a team sweeps these matches back to back, it really shakes things up as far as season series and advantage in the standings. And that's certainly what we could see this week if both of these teams sweep. The Elks and the Bombers, they're solidifying positions and really making a push for playoffs, or even, in the Bombers' case, fighting for that first overall spot.
I'm just saying that I think for marketing purposes, and especially now that CTV is on board, starting with the Banjo Bowl, CTV is showing Saturday afternoon games. And they haven't been on the CFL's clock since about 2012 when they showed the Grey Cup, and that was the Argonauts and the Stampeders, the 100th. The whole idea of getting CTV back on is, of course, to expand the audience. And obviously CTV sees the numbers and realizes that, hey, this is worth it to us.
I believe it's been about 28 years since they had a regular season game on CTV. This is a big moment to draw some more fans in. I'm a little bit surprised that it's not simulcast on TSN as well. This game is only available on CTV, which there's some pros and cons to that, but getting it back on a regular major network in Canada is a big plus for the CFL.
TSN production with CTV just picking up the simulcast and running it on all their channels. I think it's wonderful, and it runs right up through the playoffs. It's something that we haven't given enough service to in our podcast. Participation in CTV, it kind of harkens back to when CBC used to be a big player in the Canadian Football League and having their Saturday afternoon games. This is a great starting point. You got to believe that this is one of the best games out there.
Third Down Gamble uses the expert resources of the Canadian Football League and 3 Down Nation. For up-to-date, insightful statistics and analysis, please visit cfl.ca and 3downnation.com. The CFL on CBC theme music is used with written permission from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation.
Thank you for listening to our show. Third Down Gamble is hosted on Podbean. Follow us on Twitter, where our handle is @ThirdDownGamble. Join us again next time. The Third Down Gamble podcast. Audio worth watching.